The most successful people you know don't wake up at 5 a.m. because they're disciplined. They wake up at 5 a.m. because they've learned something you haven't been told. Your brain at 10 p.m. is literally a different person than your brain at 6 a.m. And that difference is the difference between who you are and who you keep promising to become. But here's what nobody tells you about the 5 a.m. habit and why, for most people, it doesn't just fail, it backfires. Meet Sarah. Sarah is 34. She works in marketing operations. That means her job is basically putting out fires that other people started. She's smart, she reads, she's watched every productivity video YouTube has ever recommended to her. For the last 3 years, Sarah has been trying to become a morning person. She sets her alarm for 5 a.m. on Sunday night. She tells herself, this is the week. I'm going to wake up early. I'm going to meditate. I'm going to plan my day. I'm finally going to get ahead. The alarm goes off at 5 a.m. She hits snooze. At 5:09, she hits it again. At 5:18, she turns it off entirely, tells herself she'll wake up at 6:30 and still get everything done, and then wakes up at 7:45 in a panic, scrolls Instagram while brushing her teeth, walks into her first meeting already exhausted from the shame of failing, again at something that seems so simple. Here's the part that haunts Sarah. She knows successful people who wake up early. She's read the articles, she's seen the TikToks of CEOs with their cold plunges and their gratitude journals, and every night, lying in bed, she genuinely believes tomorrow will be different. But it's not. And she started to believe something else, too. Something quieter, something she hasn't said out loud. Maybe I just don't have what it takes. Let me show you why Sarah is wrong and why her 5 a.m. habit was doomed from the start, for reasons that have nothing to do with willpower.
Here's the question Sarah can't answer. Why does she genuinely want to wake up early at night, but genuinely cannot make herself do it in the morning? This isn't a motivational problem. It's not laziness. It's not a lack of character. It's a neurological fact. Your brain at 10 p.m. and your brain at 6 a.m. are not the same person. A 2013 study from Harvard University found that the brain's valuation system, the part that decides how much you want something, shifts dramatically depending on time of day and, more importantly, temporal distance. When you make a decision about future you, your brain processes it almost like you're making a decision for a stranger. The emotional weight isn't there. That's why at 10 p.m., Sarah can promise herself she'll wake up at 5 a.m. Future Sarah feels abstract, distant, like someone else's problem. But at 5 a.m., that's not future Sarah, that's current Sarah. And current Sarah is warm, tired, and facing a choice between 90 more minutes of sleep and a cold kitchen. Current Sarah has needs, and current Sarah really likes her pillow. This is called temporal discounting or delay discounting. It's one of the most well-replicated findings in behavioral economics. But here's where it gets interesting, and where everything Sarah thinks she knows about the 5 a.m. habit starts to crack. The conventional wisdom says, you need discipline. You need to just do it. You need to be the kind of person who wakes up early. That advice comes from people who don't understand how the brain actually works. Let me explain what's really happening when Sarah sets that 5 a.m. alarm. At night, Sarah's brain is operating in what neuroscientists call cognitive future mode. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for long-term planning, impulse control, and goal setting, is fully online. She can imagine tomorrow. She can feel the satisfaction of a productive morning. She can see the version of herself who wakes up early. That version of Sarah feels real because to the prefrontal cortex, imagined futures activate many of the same neural circuits as actual memories. But here's the trap. When the alarm goes off at 5 a.m., Sarah's brain shifts into cognitive present mode. The prefrontal cortex is not fully online yet. It takes 20 to 30 minutes after waking for executive function to ramp up. What is online is the limbic system, the emotional brain, the part that cares about comfort, safety, and avoiding immediate discomfort. So Sarah at 5 a.m. is not a weaker version of Sarah at 10 p.m. She is a neurologically different decision maker. The 10 p.m. Sarah made a plan for a person who doesn't exist at 5 a.m. Let me ask you something, and I want you to be honest. How many times have you gone to bed saying, I'll wake up early and exercise, and then woken up and chosen sleep? How many times have you told yourself, I won't scroll on my phone tonight, and then found yourself 2 hours deep at midnight? That's not a character flaw. That's a design flaw in the architecture of your own brain. And here's what the wealthy and the strategically successful understand that Sarah doesn't. They don't rely on their future self to keep promises. They build systems that make the present self's choice irrelevant.
A 2018 study from Stanford's Graduate School of Business looked at what they called pre-commitment devices, essentially ways of binding your future self so you can't fail even when you want to. The researchers found that people who used even simple pre-commitments, like scheduling a workout with a friend who would know if they didn't show up, were 76% more likely to follow through on morning goals than people who relied on motivation alone. But here's what the Stanford researchers also found. The most effective pre-commitments weren't social or financial. They were environmental, meaning the people who successfully built a 5 a.m. habit didn't wake up every morning and decide to get up. They redesigned their environment so that staying in bed was actually harder than getting out of it. Let me give you a Machiavellian lens on this, because this is where Psych Uncovered separates from every other channel telling you to just build discipline. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that a ruler should never put himself in a position where his success depends on his own virtue in a moment of weakness. He said, "Men are wicked, and they will not keep their promises to you if you give them an excuse." He was talking about politics, but he could have been talking about your brain at 5 a.m. The wealthy don't play by the rules of willpower because they know willpower is a finite resource that depletes. They play by the rules of strategic self-binding. They remove the choice entirely. They don't wake up and ask, "Should I get up?" They wake up in a room where the thermostat is programmed to drop to 58 degrees at 5:55 a.m., where their phone is in a locked box across the room, where their running shoes are already on their feet. But here's what almost nobody realizes. The 5 a.m. habit that actually turns failure into success isn't about waking up early at all. Let me describe something to you. And again, just be honest with yourself. You have a version of yourself that you believe in, the version that wakes up early, that gets the work done before anyone else is awake, that reads instead of scrolls, that moves towards your goals while the world is still sleeping. You've met that version of yourself, usually around 10 p.m. when you're lying in bed and the day's distractions have faded and you can finally see who you want to be.
And then morning comes, and that person disappears, and you're left with the version of yourself who just doesn't. And you started to wonder, quietly, maybe even unconsciously, if maybe that person you believe in at night isn't real. If maybe the morning version is the real you, and the nighttime version is just dreaming. That thought, the one that says, maybe I'm just not that person, that thought is the single most expensive belief you will ever hold. Because it's not true. It's not even close to true. That nighttime version of you is real. That person does exist. But that person doesn't have decision-making power at 5 a.m. That person has power at 9 p.m. when you set up the environment, when you remove the choices, when you make failure impossible before you're ever tested. You haven't failed at the 5 a.m. habit because you lack discipline. You've failed because you've been asking your 5 a.m. self to make a decision that your 10 p.m. self should have already made for them. So here's the shift, and I want you to hear this differently from every other productivity tip you've ever gotten. Stop trying to become a person who wakes up early. Start treating your 10 p.m. self as the CEO and your 5 a.m. self as an employee who cannot be trusted with decisions. That means at night, you don't just set an alarm, you move your phone across the room. You put your workout clothes on top of your phone. You set your coffee maker on a timer so the smell is already in the air. You sleep in clothes you can exercise in if you have to. You don't ask your 5 a.m. self to choose to get up. You make staying in bed the more annoying, less convenient option. But there's another layer, and this is what the Stanford study hinted at but didn't fully name. The people who actually transform their lives with the 5 a.m. habit don't just use it for tasks, they use it for identity construction. Here's what that means. When Sarah wakes up and immediately opens her laptop to check email, she's training her brain that the morning is for reacting, for serving other people's priorities, for staying exactly who she already is. But when she wakes up and asks herself one question, who am I deciding to be today, before she does anything else, that's different. That's a neural pathway being built. That's an identity being claimed before the world gets a chance to argue with it. Back to Sarah. If Sarah stops setting a 5 a.m. alarm and hoping, and instead at 10 p.m. puts her phone in a kitchen lockbox, sets her thermostat to 62 degrees, and lays out everything she needs for her morning work on top of the lockbox key, she doesn't need discipline at 5 a.m. She needs to be slightly more annoyed by the cold and the inconvenience than the idea of doing the hard thing. And that's a much lower bar. Then, in that quiet hour, before the tasks and the noise and the emails, she sits with one question. What would someone who has already broken their failure loop do right now? And then she does that thing before 7 a.m. 3 months later, Sarah finished the proposal she'd been avoiding for 2 years. She sent it, the meeting happened, the promotion conversation finally occurred. Not because she became a different person, because she stopped asking her morning self to make decisions her night self should have already locked in. Here's what I keep coming back to. The 5 a.m. alarm doesn't create discipline, it creates a choice point. A brief, quiet moment before the noise arrives when you get to answer a question most people never consciously ask themselves. The question isn't, how do I wake up earlier? The question isn't even, what task should I do first? The question is, who have you been quietly deciding you are every morning without realizing it? And if you don't like that answer, you already know what to do tonight. See you in the next one.